In the deep summer of 1881, the Jacobs family estate stood like a monument to dignity. Built of pale timber and brick, it perched on the edge of Coweta County's oldest road, just where the trees thinned and the red clay began to crack. From the outside, the house was everything a Southern legacy should be. Columns straight, shutters painted, and gardenias blooming beside a porch that had never known a cobweb. Its beauty was the kind people nodded at without stopping. Its perfection didn't welcome strangers. It warned them. The locals called it the Jacobs House with a kind of respectful caution, as though to say its name too quickly might invite something out. They admired the way Constance Jacobs never raised her voice, how her dresses were never wrinkled, and how her husband Abel ran the estate with quiet command. And when one by one, the black servants hired from nearby counties began to disappear, there were no questions. The town of Cedar Hollow had long ago taught itself not to pry where old money lived. It started small. One boy didn't come home from the fields. His mother assumed he'd run off to Atlanta. Another, a girl of only 15, was said to have stolen silverware and fled in shame. Each time a servant vanished, the story was offered gently by Abel or Constance. They never seemed angry, only disappointed. They would shake their heads, speak softly about the difficulty of hiring reliable help these days, and then return to tending the roses. And because the Jacobs family attended church every Sunday, donated flour to the poor, and never once showed temper in public, the town buried its doubts beneath politeness. What wasn't said grew heavier than what was. Inside the house, time moved differently. Servants who remained longer than a week reported dreams that didn't feel like dreams, hearing footsteps behind them even when standing still, or whispers humming from the wallpaper as they dusted the parlors. Those who dared mention it found themselves reassigned to the garden or the smokehouse, then quietly released. No one spoke of the rooms at the far end of the second floor, the ones that were always locked but never discussed. Those who accidentally tried the knobs said they felt cold, even when the Georgia air outside boiled. It was said that Constance had once given birth to a stillborn daughter, and that afterward certain rooms were closed out of grief. No one questioned a mother's mourning, but grief was never seen on her face, not once, not in church, not in the cemetery, not even when her husband lost his brother in the war. Constance Jacobs wept for nothing, and neither did the house. It stood silent through each season, even as the list of missing grew long enough to echo. Yet no sheriff came knocking, no paper printed their names, only the black families whispered of it to one another. They said there were spirits trapped in the dirt behind the barn, that the land had once belonged to Creek people, and that something sacred had been broken long before the house was ever built. But the town had stopped listening to the truth of black voices long ago. Still, there were things no one could quite ignore. The way the smokehouse always burned, though no meat was ever sold. The odd stench in early mornings like copper and vinegar drifting on the wind, or the dogs that refused to go near the root cellar, barking and whimpering until pulled away. Occasionally, a hired hand from outside the county would vanish before the week's end. But the pay was good and the Jacobs name was powerful. So the silence continued thick and suffocating, until it became the very air around the estate. Cedar Hollow aged quietly around it. Boys became men, fields turned over, and the Jacobs family estate remained untouched. The garden never died. The paint never peeled. The house never sagged, and no visitor remembered hearing the floorboards creak. It was as though time respected the place, perhaps even feared it. Beneath the smiles and soft voices, something had made a home in the walls. It did not hunger loudly. It fed in whispers. and each servant who entered unaware of what lived beneath the floors was simply one more name never carved into a grave. Beneath the Jacobs estate there was a cellar unlike any other in Coweta County. While most cellars in Georgia were damp, cluttered spaces for jars of pickles, rusting tools, or forgotten furniture, Constance Jacobs kept hers like a sacred chamber. No dust clung to the beams, no cobweb dared stretch across the corners, and the stone floor gleamed with a polish that seemed unnatural for a place meant to hold coal and wine. Visitors who stayed at the house often praised her immaculate kitchen, her well-tended garden, and her spotless linens, but what none of them ever saw was the cellar. No servant entered it. No husband claimed to need it. The door was always locked, the key always heavy in her apron pocket, and only Constance knew why the air below smelled faintly of roses one day and like burned iron the next. To the world above, she was the model of Southern grace. Her voice was soft, her hair pinned carefully at the nape of her neck, her posture straight as though she had been born in a pew. When she walked into Sunday Mass, she lowered her eyes and folded her hands with a reverence that charmed even those who disliked her distance. But the preacher, Reverend Albright, noticed what others chose to ignore. She sang no hymns, not even the ones every child in the county knew. Her lips moved, but her throat made no sound. When others wept during prayers for the departed, her gaze remained steady, her hands still. He wondered in private what sort of woman could bow so perfectly and yet give nothing of herself to God. He wondered why her eyes lingered on the crucifix as though measuring it, studying its geometry instead of its meaning. Inside the cellar, answers waited in silence. Constance did not clean it simply out of pride. She scrubbed until her knuckles split because the smallest stain, the faintest trace, would betray her order. Evil in her mind was not chaos but discipline. She believed that suffering had to be arranged like fine china, polished and placed in its proper place. On one shelf stood jars filled not with peaches or beans but with powders and oils, each labeled with her careful hand. Beside them hung bundles of herbs, some common, others gathered from swamps and forests, that no polite woman was expected to walk alone. And along the far wall, iron hooks protruded from the stone, gleaming as though freshly oiled. They were never rusted. They were never empty for long. Constance had developed a way of thinking that no preacher could ever have broken. She saw the human body as a canvas and pain as its brush. She believed that if the body could be made to endure in silence without complaint, then its spirit was refined, and she collected those moments of refinement like precious gems. She would whisper to herself as she worked, asking no forgiveness and offering no cruelty in her tone. To her it was no more sinful than polishing silver or starching linen. She was simply maintaining her household, and in her mind the cellar was an extension of her parlor, a place where things were put in order, where dirt was washed away, where chaos was corrected. Neighbors often wondered why the Jacobs family seemed untouched by the troubles that plagued others. Their livestock never died of fever. Their children never fell ill. Their orchard bore more fruit than the soil should have allowed. They credited Abel's good management or the Lord's favor, but never once considered what Constance might have bartered for those blessings beneath the ground. They never knew that when she walked into Sunday Mass in her spotless white dress, she had only hours before stood in the cellar rinsing the floor clean with water drawn from the well, her apron damp with the effort of erasing what no one must see. Reverend Albright grew unsettled in her presence. He told his wife once in a whisper that there was something unbending in Constance, something colder than pride. Yet he too said nothing. The Jacobs name was too strong and the town too dependent on their donations. Silence once again was easier than truth. And so the cellar remained her domain, hidden from every eye but her own, the cleanest in all of Coweta County. gleaming like an altar built not for worship but for control. It waited beneath the earth, patient and polished, for the next moment when Constance Jacobs would descend the steps with her key in hand, carrying with her the belief that what she did was not cruelty at all, but necessary order. The Jacobs estate kept its silence well, but silence could not calm a child's fear. When Hester, a young servant girl, failed to return home one evening, her younger brother crept across the fields under cover of night. He was no older than 10, but he carried with him the kind of desperation only grief can carve. The house loomed above him, lit faintly by lanterns, too quiet for a place that should have been alive with work. He moved toward the woodpile, certain his sister had once told him she was sent there after dusk. The smell of sap and earth clung heavy in the air, but as he sifted through the stacked logs, something unnatural pressed itself into his small hands. At first he thought it was only scraps of cloth, perhaps torn from an apron, but the longer he held them, the clearer the shape became. Small figures bound together from rags, splinters of bone and twine. Their faces were stitched crudely from thread, with eyes made of charcoal dots. Some were wrapped in locks of hair, black, brown, and even pale blonde, braided tightly as though to trap something within. They were not toys. They were not art. They carried a weight that a child could feel even without words. Each one seemed to radiate the echo of a scream that had once been swallowed whole. The boy's breath quickened as he noticed how many there were. Dozens tucked between the logs, arranged in neat bundles as though they were waiting for someone to retrieve them. One of the dolls wore a strip of fabric he recognized, a faded piece of his sister's dress that their mother had sewn only weeks before. His hands trembled, yet he could not drop it. The figure felt warm, as though recently touched. For a moment he swore he heard his sister's voice in the leaves behind him, but when he turned, nothing stirred. Fear clawed through him, but curiosity forced him one step deeper into the woodpile. And there he saw what no child should see. Some of the dolls had bones not from animals but from fingers, small and thin, polished clean. They had been arranged with care, as though each figure was a record, a preserved memory, or perhaps a trophy. He could not understand the ritual, but he understood enough to know his sister was gone. The night air seemed to close in on him, heavy and sharp, until he ran barefoot into the dark, clutching the cloth and bone figure against his chest, carrying proof of a horror no adult in Cedar Hollow would ever admit to hearing. Dr. Ezra Wilkes arrived at the Jacobs estate with the quiet courtesy of a man used to being welcomed. He was a traveling physician, the kind who moved from farm to farm with his black bag, stitching wounds and delivering babies, always carrying the smell of herbs and tobacco with him. The Jacobs family invited him in with grace, offering supper and a room for the night, but from the moment he crossed their threshold, something pressed against him that felt less like hospitality and more like inspection. Constance smiled gently, though her eyes seemed to weigh him, as though deciding what sort of man he was and how long his presence should be tolerated. The estate struck him first with its silence. In houses of such size there were always sounds, pots clanging in the kitchen, footsteps across floorboards, a cough or laugh from the servant quarters. But here the corridors whispered with nothing at all. He noticed that the servant cabins near the edge of the field stood abandoned, their chimneys cold, their porches bare of shoes or laundry. When he asked after the staff, Abel Jacobs explained that help had been dismissed for unreliability, and new arrangements were being made. His tone was calm, without anger, but there was a finality in his words that discouraged further inquiry. Wilkes smiled politely, though he made a note of it in his mind. A house of this size should not be so still. At supper the food was prepared beautifully but set on the table without ceremony, as though it had appeared by unseen hands. The doctor, uneasy but cautious, wondered who had carried it in if no servants remained. He watched Constance cut her meat with perfect poise, never once looking at the food, her gaze fixed instead on the candlesticks that framed the table. She asked him about his travels, his health, his work, but never once did she ask a question whose answer truly mattered. It was conversation without weight, a veil stretched thinly over something far more deliberate. That night, when he retired to his guest room, he could not sleep. The house was too silent, yet beneath that silence came noises he could not place. He heard faint scratching, as if fingernails dragged across wood. At another moment, a low moan carried through the floorboards, so brief he almost convinced himself he imagined it. He rose and walked the hallway. Every door he tried was locked. Some gave slightly as though someone inside pressed against them, but no voice answered when he whispered through the cracks. He found one door with an iron lock that looked newer than the others, polished and unmarked by years of use. He pressed his ear to it and thought he heard breathing on the other side. Slow, measured, as if someone forced themselves into silence. He returned to his room unsettled, his mind caught between suspicion and disbelief. In the morning, Wilkes excused himself early, claiming duties in another county. But before leaving, he sat at the small desk provided in his room and began to write. He described the silence of the house, the emptiness of the quarters, the unnatural stillness of the family. He wrote about the locked doors and the faint sounds he could not explain. His language was careful but urgent, meant for colleagues he trusted in Savannah. He folded the letters neatly, intending to post them when he reached town. Yet as he packed his satchel, he noticed something that turned his stomach cold. The letters he had written the night before, sealed, folded, and placed on the desk, were gone. In their place was only a clean sheet of paper, blank except for a single pressed gardenia laid in the center. Wilkes left the house that afternoon, polite as always, but his hands trembled on the reins as he rode away. He would never speak openly of what he had seen, for the Jacobs name weighed heavily in the county, and he feared being disbelieved. His journals would later record fragments of that visit, though none of his letters would ever reach their intended hands. It was as though the estate had swallowed them whole, along with whatever truths they carried. And in the silence left behind, the Jacobs house remained untouched, its locked doors waiting for the next set of footsteps bold enough to linger too long in its halls. Decades after the Jacobs estate had begun to rot into memory, hunters combing through the woods came across a journal half buried in damp soil, its leather warped, its ink blurred in places but not erased. The first pages seemed ordinary, with neat handwriting describing the weather, crop yields, and casual notes of daily life. But further in, the words shifted into something darker. Measured observations, cold instructions, each one signed only with the initial J. It read less like a diary and more like a manual, a record of experiments where suffering was calculated the way a mathematician calculates sums. The entries described what the author called the cruciforms, heavy frames forged of copper designed to hold a human body stretched wide without breaking it. Unlike wooden crosses that splintered or warped, copper did not rot, and the writer praised its ability to conduct heat and sound alike. Victims were bound to these forms not with rope, but with bands of leather soaked in vinegar, tightened so that the flesh beneath swelled until it burned. What followed was the true purpose of the design. Holes were drilled into the long bones of arms and legs, small tunnels carved with hand tools until marrow gave way. Into these wounds the writer inserted thin reeds, hollow like flutes. The air of the body, the journal claimed, carried the voice of pain through these channels, creating tones that could be drawn out, extended, bent into shrill notes that lasted far beyond the victim's own scream. The journal described this with fascination, not pity. The author noted how the cries did not simply echo but transformed into something almost choral, a symphony of agony where each drilled bone gave a different pitch. The ribs, when pierced, produced deeper notes, low groans like a pipe organ beneath the shrieking reeds of the limbs. The writer recorded it as if composing music, detailing the best places to drill for harmony, which bones cracked too easily, which bodies endured longest. Pages were filled with sketches of the frames, diagrams of angles and placements, and marks resembling sheet music annotated with words like sustained, sharp, and resolved. What unsettled most was not just the cruelty but the calm precision. There was no hatred in the writing, no gloating. Each experiment was described as though the subject were a tool, a vessel of study. The writer mentioned that silence was the true enemy, that the absence of sound was wasteful, and that the human frame must be refined until it could no longer resist voicing its torment. The hollow bones became, in this mind, instruments of truth. One chilling entry read, "Only through resonance does the body confess its final order." The pages gave no indication whether these rituals were meant as science, punishment, or worship. They seemed to be all three, tangled into something that blurred morality into method. When scholars later examined the journal, they debated whether the author was Abel or Constance Jacobs, or perhaps another hand altogether. The single letter J left no clear answer. What was certain was that the entries matched too closely with whispered memories of the estate. The strange noises reported at night, the absence of servants, the unnatural silence that covered the house during the day. Those who had once doubted began to wonder if the sounds neighbors had dismissed as imagination had in fact been the resonance of hollowed bones, carried through copper frames beneath the ground. The journal's final entry ended without conclusion. A sentence broke off mid-thought, ink blotting into the page as though the hand that wrote it had been interrupted. The last words were plain. The body is never silent if tuned correctly. And then nothing more. That unfinished line left the reader staring, imagining what final experiment was never recorded, what truth remained buried with the missing. Jonah and Ruth were brother and sister, sold young into service at the Jacobs estate. Their arrival met with the same polite silence that always followed new hands. They were strong for their age, accustomed to field work, and though their grandmother wept as they were taken, she whispered that they must endure, that survival was its own kind of victory. The town saw their sale as nothing remarkable. Children moved through households like tools in those years, passed quietly from family to family. But what marked Jonah and Ruth was not their labor, it was the speed of their disappearance. Within 2 weeks, both were gone. No word, no sighting, no trace. Abel Jacobs told a neighbor that the children had run away under cover of night, stealing biscuits from the kitchen before vanishing into the pines. The story was spoken gently, delivered with regret, but behind his measured tone was the finality that always followed loss within that house. No one challenged it. No one asked what children without shoes could have carried themselves into the wild and survived. The town listened, nodded, and returned to their lives, leaving the silence to thicken. Their grandmother did not. She was an old woman known in the woods as a root worker, one of the few who kept alive the practices of herbs, prayers, and charms passed down through bloodlines the county tried to erase. She walked the dirt road to the Jacobs gate carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. Some said she placed it at the doorstep, others swore she buried it beneath the gardenias. What she left behind was not meant for mortal eyes, but all agreed she called down a curse that day. Her neighbors heard her voice rising in the night, naming the Jacobs family and binding their name to the spirits of the land. She spoke of children swallowed whole, of voices silenced beneath floors, of a reckoning that would one day turn back upon the ones who had fed so long on suffering. Constance Jacobs heard of the old woman's words and did not flinch. To her, such curses were nothing but theater, powerless against the order she maintained in her house. Yet within days, the grandmother was found in her cabin, lifeless upon her bed. Her tongue had been cut from her mouth, leaving her face frozen in a grotesque silence. Her eyes had been sewn shut with threads of white lace, delicate and precise as though mocking her prayers. Those who discovered her whispered that it was no murder of rage but of craft, a killing performed like embroidery. Her hands were folded neatly across her chest, and in her palms lay two small bones, smooth and polished, each carved with a mark that no one recognized. The sheriff declared it a robbery gone wrong, though nothing had been stolen, and the matter was closed without ceremony. Whispers spread through the black community that the Jacobs estate had answered the curse with its own ritual, that Constance herself had delivered the old woman's punishment. They spoke in secret of how Jonah and Ruth had likely never left the house at all, how the cellar and locked rooms had claimed them the way it had claimed so many before. Mothers warned their children not to walk near the Jacobs land. Fathers prayed that no debt or circumstance would ever bind their families to that name. And yet, in the polite gatherings of Cedar Hollow's white citizens, nothing was said. The Jacobs family still arrived at church in clean clothes, still offered baskets of fruit to the needy, still nodded with grace at every greeting. The story of Jonah and Ruth was treated as nothing more than a sad accident, a pair of runaways lost to the wilderness, their grandmother's death blamed on her own eccentric life. But the truth lingered heavy and sharp in the air of the estate itself. There were nights when faint childlike cries seemed to seep from the soil near the barn, muffled as though choked by dirt. Some swore they saw pale figures darting between the trees, their outlines blurred like smoke. Others reported hearing a woman humming in the distance, her song carrying no tune, only rhythm, like the steady turn of a wheel or the beating of a drum. The house never confirmed these things, but neither did it deny them. The disappearance of Jonah and Ruth marked more than another pair of names lost. It marked a moment when silence itself became the county's accomplice. For the Jacobs family, it was another act in a methodical pattern, another refinement in their hidden ritual of order. For the grandmother, it was a curse returned in kind, her final attempt to make the earth speak on behalf of the stolen. And for Cedar Hollow, it was a reminder of what happened when truth tried to rise where no one wished to see. Beneath the Jacobs estate, long after its surface beauty had begun to fade, a hidden room was uncovered during the slow demolition of its crumbling foundations. At first it seemed only an odd extension of the cellar, a chamber walled off with deliberate care. But when the debris was cleared and light fell across its interior, those who looked inside understood it was no cellar. It was a playroom, or what had once masqueraded as one. The walls were paneled not in wood but in mirrors, each cut into uneven shapes, fitted like shards, so that any movement cast dozens of broken reflections. To stand within it was to be watched from every angle, your own face staring back, fractured, distorted, impossible to escape. And across the glass, faint red etchings spread like veins carved into the surface with sharp hands. Symbols, words, and sketches lay hidden in plain sight, their meanings unclear but their intention unmistakable. Some spoke of faith twisted inside out, others of geometry bent toward ritual, but all were arranged with purpose, as if to cage the mind as firmly as the walls caged the body. At the center of the room stood a single chair, bolted to the floor, its arms and legs carved with restraints. It was not built for comfort. The seat was narrow, the back rigid, and around its base lay marks in the floor where the chair had been spun in circles again and again, until the grooves deepened like scars. Whoever sat in that chair would not have been allowed rest. The spinning was deliberate, slow enough to exhaust, but never enough to let unconsciousness win. and on the nearby shelf rested cylinders of wax, each one carved with initials, each one made to hold sound. When the cylinders were tested years later, faint voices spilled from them, hoarse whispers repeating fragments of prayers, pleas, and sometimes the echo of laughter that cracked into sobbing. They were not voices of choice, but of record, cut into the wax by someone who believed the breaking point of the human mind was worth preserving. The mirrors multiplied this torment. A victim strapped to the chair could not close their eyes without seeing dozens of versions of themselves suffering. Some mirrors bent reflections tall and thin, others short and twisted, some showing faces blurred into monstrous shapes. Every scream returned not only as sound but as image, trapped and multiplied until even the victim's own self became an enemy. And above, etched across the ceiling, were words written backward, visible only through reflection, sentences demanding silence, obedience, surrender. To any child, it would have seemed a cruel game. To the Jacobs family, it was an instrument of precision, a way to strip away identity until nothing but silence remained. The discovery of this room chilled even those accustomed to stories of cruelty. For it was not only a place of punishment, but of design, a room constructed with patience and foresight. It revealed a mind that understood how to collapse a person not just with pain, but with their own reflection, their own voice, their own exhaustion. Evil here was not loud or wild. It was clinical, careful, as if someone had studied how far the mind could bend before it shattered. And as the sunlight finally touched those mirrors, the last observers noted their own faces looking back, fractured and strange, a reminder that the house had always been built to consume the ones who entered it piece by piece until nothing human remained. Elias was 12 years old when the Jacobs family took him into their house. He had been mute since birth, a boy who communicated only with his hands and wide, searching eyes. To the outside world, his silence made him easy to forget. One of those children who could be placed anywhere because he could never complain, never speak against what was done to him. For Constance Jacobs, this silence was not a weakness, but an opportunity. She saw in him a perfect vessel, a child who could be tested and broken without leaving behind the dangerous noise of testimony. He was found one morning in a locked room of the estate, the door sealed from the outside, the window nailed shut. His body lay curled on the floor, his lips darkened, his chest sunken as though crushed from within. When the local coroner examined him, expecting drowning or beating, he found neither. There was no water in his lungs, no bruising on his skin, no sign of violence that could explain the collapse of his body. Instead, the boy's throat was packed with soil, pressed so tightly that it seemed forced into him by hand or ritual. His lungs had collapsed as though they had been denied air, yet no rope had touched his neck. And on the soles of his feet the coroner noted strange abrasions, not wounds exactly, but worn marks, the kind made by constant movement, the kind that would come from hours of forced dancing. The Jacobs house had long been whispered about, but Elias's death deepened those whispers into something more fearful. Neighbors muttered that he had been made to dance until his body broke, until breath itself rebelled and lungs closed in protest. Others spoke of the soil, wondering what meaning it carried, why it had been chosen as the instrument of silence. Some believed it was symbolic, the land reclaiming him, a ritual meant to bury the child alive in spirit before his body followed. To Constance, perhaps, the act was logical, an extension of her belief that order required discipline, that even silence must be punished when it belonged to the powerless. A mute child could not scream, but his body could still be forced to confess through suffering. The locked room where Elias was found bore its own evidence. The floor was scuffed in circles, worn smooth by small bare feet turning again and again. In the corner stood a phonograph, its wax cylinder broken but still bearing grooves of sound. Those who tried to play it later swore they heard faint music, uneven and distorted like a waltz slowed to a crawl, repeating the same bars endlessly. It was as though Elias had been made to move in rhythm to a tune that never stopped until exhaustion claimed him. The soil in his throat suggested he had collapsed at last, his body refusing to obey. And someone had pressed the earth into him as the final act, suffocating what remained of his quiet rebellion. No inquiry followed. The Jacobs family claimed the boy had wandered into the room and suffocated on dust, a strange but natural accident. The sheriff accepted it, the town accepted it, and the body was buried without ceremony. No stone bore his name. His silence followed him even into the ground. Yet the details lived on in private memory, the marks on his feet, the dirt in his throat, the locked door that should never have been locked. Those who cared to think of it understood this was not an accident, but performance. A ritual meant not only to kill, but to test, to see how far the human body could be bent under rhythm and soil, under order and silence. In death, Elias became another fragment of the Jacobs house's hidden legacy, another experiment cloaked in normalcy, another whisper no one dared to name aloud. The locked room was boarded shut after his burial, but the scuffs on the floor remained beneath the planks, traces of a boy who danced until death claimed him. A child who drowned without water in a house that had long since learned to swallow every truth it created. Abel Jacobs was remembered in town as a man of dignity, a patriarch who spoke in measured tones and never raised his voice even in anger. He gave speeches at community gatherings about civility, about the importance of order and self-control, about how a family's strength lay in restraint. His words were quoted in church bulletins and praised by neighbors who believed him a model of composure in a world that too often leaned toward violence. Yet the records found years later, hidden beneath the false boards of his study, told of another Abel, one whose fascination with restraint was not moral but anatomical, a man who studied the limits of the body with the patience of a craftsman. The journals he left behind did not speak of anger or cruelty. They read instead like lessons in discipline. He wrote of bloodless control, a method by which pain could be applied and studied without the mess of tearing flesh. He designed instruments that pinched nerves without cutting them, braces that bent joints slowly until cartilage strained, clamps that could compress muscles until circulation faltered without leaving visible wounds. He measured the exact moment when breath shortened, when the skin cooled, when the eyes lost focus. To him, suffering was not chaos but science, a way to understand the hidden mechanics of the human frame. He treated his victims not as people but as experiments, bodies reduced to diagrams in his ledgers, each assigned a number, each annotated with notes on endurance. Those who later examined the evidence found jars hidden in the house tucked beneath the piano where Abel had once played hymns for his family. Inside them floated organs suspended in hardened wax and candle fat, preserved not for medicine but for study. Each jar bore a label in his hand, describing not the organ's function but the condition under which it had failed. Liver, silent compression, 37 minutes. Heart, restraint with breath control, 11 cycles. The labels were calm, almost proud, written in the same hand that had once penned sermons on discipline. The dissonance was striking. A man praised for speaking of virtue while privately building a museum of human endurance, collected organ by organ proof of his control over the flesh of others. In public, Abel Jacobs presented himself as a man who detested violence. He spoke against drunkenness, against disorder, against the loud, unrefined displays of cruelty he claimed dishonored a household. Yet in private he refined a form of cruelty so clean, so methodical, that it left behind no wounds for others to question. Servants could vanish, and nothing in their bodies would betray what had been done, save for the missing organs carefully stored beneath the family piano. This was his art, the dissection of the living without spilling blood, the study of human suffering without leaving scars. Neighbors remembered him as courteous, even kind. They spoke of the way he tipped his hat, how he offered polite blessings, how he carried himself with quiet grace. No one suspected that when he left the parlor to fetch a book or excused himself early from supper, he often walked to his study, where another journal waited for his hand. There he recorded not his family's history but his hidden craft, pages filled with observations that reduced life into sequences of pressure, silence, and collapse. His restraint, which so many admired in public, was not moral strength at all. It was the cold patience of a man who believed suffering could be perfected, catalogued, preserved. The jars beneath the piano remained long after his death, sealed and dusted, their labels still legible. They told the truth that Abel Jacobs never admitted aloud, that beneath the speeches of civility, beneath the mask of dignity, he had built a shrine to control, an archive of silence where the human body was not sacred but a subject, opened and restrained until it yielded its last secret without a single drop of blood spilled on the floor. In the heat-thick attic of the Jacobs house, where the air carried both dust and the faint perfume of roses dried long ago, the men sent to dismantle the roof uncovered something that should never have been built. At first it looked like a wardrobe under a sailcloth, but when they dragged the covering aside, a storm of salt crystals stung their tongues, and the figure beneath came into view. It was human in outline, though taller than any woman in Cedar Hollow, and at once the shape was familiar. The narrow waist, the poised neck, the lifted chin, it was Constance Jacobs herself, raised again not in paint or marble but from flesh, bone, and salt. The body had been built like a quilt, each strip of preserved skin cut into squares and stitched edge to edge, pressed with coarse grains until the surface hardened to a pale shine. Beneath the panels, a frame of wire and jointed bone held everything upright, vertebrae from more than one spine fitted together like carpentry, ribs latticed to form a chest, pelvis braced on a stand soaked in brine. The sight was grotesque, yet the work was careful, calm, and patient, not frenzy but discipline. Every piece had been chosen with intent. The face was unfinished but carried enough detail to mark its likeness. One cheek had been cured and shaped, bearing the faint line of a smile that was never seen in life. The scalp held pinned braids of hair sorted into bundles, each tied to cards with faint initials written in the same precise hand that filled ledgers in the study. Some strands were black, some brown, some pale as corn silk. They had not come from one head. In a dish nearby lay glass eyes painted gray, ready to be set in sockets carved too wide, eyes that matched the cold gaze Constance carried in church. Around the figure lay the tools of her order, needles, awls, rulers, brushes dipped in tallow to coat the salted flesh, muslin strips for binding edges, and a ledger that opened to a page marked simply, Arrangement, Final. The ledger did not list names but measurements, lengths of arm, girths of chest, tones of skin, not as people but as units of fabric. It was the mathematics of a seamstress who had stolen her cloth from living bodies. What gave the figure its deeper terror were the words carved across its surface. Each strip of flesh bore scripture, etched shallow so as not to tear the seams. Along the collarbone ran verses about obedience, across the throat commands for silence, over the hips, proverbs about discipline and order. The lines were chosen not for comfort but control. The same lines Constance had let pass her lips during Sunday Mass without ever lifting her voice in song. Some inscriptions were carved backward, meant to be read only in a mirror, as though the figure existed for her eyes alone. The ribs bore an unfinished sentence about love enduring, though the word love had been split, the halves circling the chest in opposite directions until they never touched. And where the heart should have been, there was only a hollow packed with salt crystals waiting for some final piece to be set in place. The men who found it argued later over how many lives it must have taken to build. Each seam was a count, each card of hair a tally, each jar of tallow a record of melted fat. Some whispered numbers that sickened them, then let the numbers go because it was easier not to know. The attic smelled like smokehouse meat and church linen, sweet and bitter, an air that forced memory of supper and funeral at once. The figure did not shout its horror. It stood calmly, a portrait of a woman who had turned order into worship, who had built her likeness from the vanished so that she would never fade. The salt preserved it as surely as silence preserved her name. When they covered the figure again, the sheet stuck to the salted surface before sliding free, leaving grains scattered like frost across the floor. One man swore he heard a faint shifting inside the hollow chest, as if crystals were still settling. Another thought he felt the attic watch him, though no eyes had yet been set in the sockets. They left quickly, but salt clung to their hands and would not wash away for days, a reminder that the portrait was not finished and perhaps never would be. Because some works are not meant to end. Some are meant to wait, patient as the woman who built them, while the house itself whispered that there was more still hidden, not above their heads but deeper behind the walls where voices had once been pressed and silenced forever. When the Jacobs estate was finally torn down in 1926, long after its name had faded from polite speech, the men who brought their hammers and axes expected rot, mildew, and rats. They did not expect the walls to weep dust that smelled like graves. As the plaster came down, the first discovery was not wood or brick, but fabric. Tiny scraps of cloth, faded and fragile, folded in layers between beams. What seemed at first like discarded rags soon revealed stitching, delicate seams, small sleeves and hems. They were children's linens, nightshirts and shifts, carefully wrapped around bones so brittle they crumbled when touched. Behind every panel of wall, behind every partition of the house, the same horror repeated, skeletons hidden upright, wrapped as though tucked into bed, their bones pressed into silence by plaster and lath. The workers pulled back in shock, but curiosity drew them deeper. Each cavity in the house was stuffed with remains, sometimes alone, sometimes clustered together as though whole groups had been packed side by side. Some skulls bore faint markings, charcoal symbols etched across the forehead and cheeks, circles, crosses, and spirals. At first the men thought them childish drawings, but one among them, a veteran of the coast, recognized fragments of African spirit wards, patterns once drawn for protection. Yet here they had been twisted, rearranged into designs that mocked their origin. A shield turned into a trap, a prayer rewritten into a curse. Whoever had placed them there had known the old forms, only to bend them into something that bound the children instead of freeing them. Even more unsettling were the notes found clutched in bony hands, or stuffed into the seams of the wrappings. Written in charcoal, their words were shaky but legible. It is cold. She says silence is obedience. If we pray wrong, she will not hear. Some were little more than scrawls of numbers, others fragments of psalms repeated until the lines collapsed into nonsense. They were not letters meant for escape, but confessions pressed into walls. Voices of children who had nowhere else to place their final words. The house itself became their confessor, swallowing their charcoal scratches until the demolition unearthed them decades later. The most terrifying discovery came in the main hall, where behind the wainscoting lay a series of bones arranged with precision, not random but methodical. Small femurs had been lined in rows, stacked like pipes of an organ, each engraved with a notch as though tested for sound. Ribs had been tied together with wire, forming a crude lattice that rattled when touched. It was not storage. It was construction. The walls turned into instruments of silence, a perversion of both architecture and ritual. The workers who found it refused to touch the pieces, swearing the air grew heavy as they drew near, as though the cries of the hidden children had soaked into the timber and still clung there, waiting. What emerged through these discoveries was not simply evidence of murder, but of a methodical design. The Jacobs family had not only been killed, they had arranged, stored, preserved. They had turned the very house into a vessel of order, each wall a coffin, each partition a shrine. The children were not laid to rest, but built into the structure, as if the family sought to bind their silence into the foundation itself. The wards mocked on their bones suggested not ignorance, but intention. Someone had known the language of protection and twisted it into the language of entrapment, bending hope into obedience. By the time the estate was reduced to rubble, dozens of skeletons had been counted, though no one agreed on the final number. Officials ordered the bones buried in unmarked pits, calling the discovery a relic of unfortunate times, refusing to let the matter stain the county's name. But the workers who had swung their hammers never forgot. They spoke of the way the walls seemed to breathe when opened, of how dust poured out not like plaster but like ash, of how the children's notes left smudges of black on their hands that no soap could wash away for weeks. The Jacobs estate was gone, its beauty broken apart beam by beam, but the silence it had enforced for decades lingered still. The children in the walls had been found, yet their names remained unspoken, their stories dismissed, their bones reburied without care. In tearing down the house, the county thought it had buried the past, but what it had truly done was prove how deeply silence could be sealed into wood and stone, and how easily a society could choose to look away when evil wore the face of civility. When the dust of the demolition settled, the bones gathered and the whispers quieted, another horror came into focus, one less visible than skeletons but heavier in weight. The names of the servants who had vanished into the Jacobs estate were nowhere to be found. Not in church ledgers, not in county records, not in graveyard listings. It was as if the house had not only consumed their bodies but erased the words that once gave them identity. Families who had whispered about lost sons and daughters searched for confirmation, some even daring to ask the courthouse for papers, but none existed. The registers showed blank spaces, as though the people had never been hired, never baptized, never born. Entire families were left with nothing to point to, no page to touch, no evidence that the ones they mourned had ever lived. This absence was no accident. It was a method. The Jacobs family had perfected the art of silence by ensuring that records never matched reality. Wages were spoken of but never written, ages guessed but never logged, contracts promised but never filed. What the neighbors accepted as Southern custom was in truth a system designed to eat names. By keeping their servants invisible on paper, the family could consume them in life without leaving behind proof. The absence became a second burial, one deeper than the first, where memory itself was lowered into the ground and covered with dirt. And because the Jacobs name was respected, no clerk dared to ask questions, no preacher dared to press. The county became a willing accomplice, sealing off every trace. By the time the land passed into the hands of a distant cousin, the horror had already been buried beneath polite silence. He was a practical man, uninterested in preserving legacies or haunting stories. He ordered the estate to collapse fully, its remains cleared and burned. Where the grand house once stood, a barn was erected, plain, sturdy, and unremarkable. There was no plaque to mark what had been, no memorial for the dead found in the walls, no marker for the dozens more whose bodies were never recovered. The new barn was painted red, its boards straight and ordinary so that future generations might never imagine what had stood before. The land was folded back into usefulness, as if usefulness itself could cover the stench of memory. Yet for those who remembered, the erasure cut deeper than any knife. Mothers had no graves to visit. Fathers had no names to speak. Siblings grew old without proof their loved ones had ever walked beside them. Their grief could not anchor to stone or soil. It hovered in silence, a wound that could not close. The Jacobs house had not only been killed, it had stolen the right to remembrance. In that theft lay its cruelest victory. For bones might one day surface, but nameless bones carry no power in the eyes of society. Without names, they could be dismissed, reburied without care, absorbed into the faceless category of tragedy. The people who lived near the land learned not to look toward it. They avoided its roads after dark, and they hushed their children when the barn was in sight. Some said the soil itself had grown restless, that crops planted there withered faster than in neighboring fields, that animals refused to settle near the fence line. But still no memorial came. The silence of the county remained absolute, as though by refusing to carve the truth in stone, they could convince themselves it had never been. The house had eaten names and the town had helped it chew. The new barn stood as a monument not to memory but to forgetting. Boards hammered over history, roof nailed against remembrance. Those who passed it in years to come saw only a barn like any other, never knowing the ground beneath held more than soil. Yet the families who had lost children, brothers, sisters, and mothers knew what was missing. They carried the names in whispers, spoken only inside their homes, because outside those walls the county had declared silence. The Jacobs estate had died in fire and dust, but its true legacy remained alive. The erasure of an entire generation vanished twice, once in flesh and again in name. In 1957, a librarian in Savannah opened a box long mislabeled as agricultural reports and found letters signed by Dr. Ezra Wilkes, the physician who had once walked the halls of the Jacobs estate. The handwriting was steady, the language clinical, yet the contents were almost unbearable. Wilkes described methods of torment not invented by imagination but by careful hands. He wrote of nerve inversion, where pain was redirected until the body begged for its own suffering. He detailed rooms of fractured mirrors designed to fold identity in on itself, forcing victims to scream at their own reflections until madness consumed them. And he spoke of devices that split breath from voice, allowing a person to breathe but never to cry out. Silence pressed into the throat like a second burial. Most chilling of all was not the content but the stamp across several pages. Received. War Office. The words confirmed that his letters had been read, studied, and filed away. Officials denied involvement when the discovery was made public, yet the markings proved otherwise. The Jacobs house was gone, but its methods had not died with it. They had been catalogued, carried forward, and hidden in the archives of silence. In 1972, Georgia passed the Unmarked Burial Protection Act, a law born not from conscience but from fear of exposure. The discovery of bones in the ruins of the Jacobs estate had stirred unease but not justice. No trial was ever held, no punishment delivered. The family line had already dissolved into wealth and distance, leaving behind no one to answer for the bodies hidden in walls and soil. The law promised protection for the dead, but it was written as if the living could still afford to forget. Graves were preserved, yet names remained lost, silence woven into every page of the statute. Only one historian refused to let the silence close completely. He wrote of the Jacobs estate not as isolated cruelty but as a mirror of society's habit of erasure. He asked again and again how many houses had devoured the nameless while smiling at Sunday service. His words unsettled those who read them not because they revealed Jacob's evil, but because they suggested it was not rare. The Jacobs family had only been methodical, not unique. Their legacy was silence, but the silence was not theirs alone. It belonged to every community that chose forgetting over memory, order over truth.